What is the point of philosophy? What is the point of doing inner work? What is the point of going through therapy or counselling or personal development or anything in that world? That's the huge question that this book that I'm recommending today tackles. Is what's the point of doing anything like this? Especially if it's just going to be abstract and thinking about ideas and intellectualizing them rather than doing anything about it. Which is why the purpose of this book is perfectly summarized in its title, which is Philosophy as a Way of Life. This goes back to the idea of the ancients when they think about philosophy. If you go back to a lot of the Greek philosophers, for example, the way it's written is typically in a dialogue form. It's not just here's a series of ideas presented to you across 200 to 1,000 pages of usually impenetrable language, unless you're used to being able to disassemble that kind of jargon. It's much more done as it's almost like a play. Well, it is a dialogue. It's one person says this, another person replies, another person replies, and another person replies. It is that engagement. It's understanding philosophy as a way of life in the sense of what should we do about this? If we've had an insight, that's great, but the insight alone is worthless. I know that might sound very, very controversial and quite strong to be able to say, but unless you do something with it, what's the point of that insight? We've likely all had those moments where we've been in the shower or we've been out for a walk or out for a run and we've had this absolutely amazing glimpse of an insight about either who we could become or this amazing idea or this huge creative approach to life. But if you don't do anything about it, it just stays as a thought. And if you don't do anything about that thought after a couple of days, sometimes a couple of hours, the thought itself disappears and you forget that you even had that thought to begin with. That's why a book like this is so important, because it's saying that we need to root this down into practical action. We need to live philosophy as a way of life, just like the ancients did. To be able to have a thought, to be able to have an idea and do something about it. So as we're looking at an idea like this, there's loads and loads of nice little quotes to be able to include in something like this, which I'll be referencing across pages 20 and 21, very much in the introduction to a book like this. And that's what we need to try to understand. Like, what's going on? What's the point of all this? And if you speak to most people nowadays, especially people who aren't philosophically trained or adept in that kind of world at all, then what they'll be doing is they'll be talking to you to give you advice, or they'll say, here's how the world occurs to me, here's what you should do as a result of it. That might be implicit, it might be explicit, but they're still telling you what to do. And what we really need to move towards in a world like this, when we consider philosophy, is to move from... We need to make sure that philosophy is forming how we make an opinion rather than informing us what that opinion should be. If that makes sense. The focus should be on to form rather than to inform. That's the whole purpose of philosophy. And as we're trying to understand these ideas, we're trying to understand what happens if I make a mistake. What happens if I start talking and I realize the premises of my argument don't actually make sense? Do you then just try to defend them, like in a very, very defensive way, or do you open up to different ideas? And if you open up to ideas, what's the transformation? How do you show up in the world differently? That's what is included with all of this. The definitions of the words themselves, just to quote from page 21, is basically irrelevant. It's all about what it looks like in real human life, which is important. To quote directly from page 21, therefore, even the definitions were nothing by themselves, independently of the road travelled to reach them. That is, and I'm somebody who was taught philosophy for 10 years, and I went to university to study it after having done philosophy at A-levels and philosophy and religion for 2 years before that. I've done philosophy for 15 years in a very, very practical way. And what we need to be aware of is that a lot of modern day philosophy, and we can go back 200 years as well for this, is arguing about the definitions of words. It's focusing entirely on language in a very abstract way, rather than focusing on what philosophy was to the ancients, which is how is this guiding and informing who I am and who I should become. You can probably start to see how when this playlist is all about deep healing in a very coaching-based sense, it's understanding, okay, I'm in this position now, and I want to be in this position in the future. How do I get from point A to point B? We can go back into the past and learn how to manage certain ideas there, but ultimately, that's what makes this a coaching platform. It's this idea that we're moving from all of that to a desired future. That's why I keep saying the same things in a lot of these videos around traits and characteristics and qualities, and using that phrase desired future, because that's what I want this to be. I want this to be practical. This isn't just lamenting about the past and feeling sorry for ourselves. It's understanding, okay, these things have shaped me for better or for worse. Here's who I am now, and here's how I'm embodying this space at this particular point in time. And also, here's who I want to be in the future. And here's how I'm going to get to that point in the future. That's what these books are all about, is understanding that process. It's connecting you as to who you are now to who you used to be and who you want to be in the future. It's that connection of that timeline. And that's why we need a book like this, like Philosophy as a Way of Life, to be able to make that useful. Because if I just sit here and talk about it to people, it doesn't mean anything. In the previous video, or one of the previous videos in this series, I talked about this idea of anxiety. I could write a full book around what the word anxiety means and how it relates to angst, and go into different philosophical approaches like to do with existentialism, and throw a load of jargon at you, especially to do with authenticity. And I could bring in the German terms based on Heidegger in terms of what does authenticity mean. But that alienates a lot of people. It's just abstract thinking and just throwing jargon, potentially to confuse the argument and also to make me look better. And that's not what this is all about. I don't care if I come across as intelligent or unintelligent in these videos. I want to make sure that you're gaining something from this, which is actually useful in your life. So as a result, that's why in the previous videos, I looked at anxiety in the sense of what does it mean to be an anxious man, like me in my 20s? What does that mean from different perspectives? What does that mean like overall? But still, all of that results in, what should I do about this? If I don't want to consider myself in that way, and I want to be able to move towards a healthier, fuller future, maybe where there is still anxiety and I'm taking that with me, but I'm relating to it differently, then I need to look at this in terms of a very pragmatic approach. That's where the ancients come in. I can understand why Stoicism, especially online on YouTube, has had a real big push in the past 10 years. Because it is quite practical. It is also a little bit misunderstood by a lot of people that I speak to them about. And there's a whole series of sections in here, especially to do with Marcus Aurelius and looking at the meditations that he wrote on a wider scale. But besides all of that, because again, we're moving into jargon territory there, it's just to make things practical. Have an insight and do something with that insight. That's what all of this is about. It's not about formally teaching philosophy and whether you get these terms right or wrong according to various philosophers. It's about what do these terms mean for you and how are you then going to live out these terms. So if I use the words, for example, anxiety, if I talk about autonomy, if I talk about agency, if I talk about this idea about being authentic, just to try to use words beginning with A for the sake of this at this point in time, sorry. What do those words mean for you? Write down a short definition for them by all means, but as long as you're grappling with these questions, that's going to inform how you then start to begin to live. And when you go off track a little bit, it's understanding, okay, that was maybe an unhealthy version of what I'm trying to aim at, but I'm aiming still for the right thing, so I'll just correct the course. There's no room there for pain or for shame, especially not toxic shame, because you're treating yourself as a human being. You're treating yourself with the right level of self-esteem, which is, I'm going to make mistakes, but I'm going to stumble forward for the sake of an ideal that I know is important to me. That's why in all these videos, sometimes I'm falling over words. Sometimes I'm tripping up over my sentences. In often cases, I apologize and say sorry and then correct it. But I'm not cutting it out of the video because that would be, for me, an inauthentic approach. I don't want an overly polished video where every single part that makes me human is cut out, every single sentence, every single stumble. I want it to be that you get an idea of who I am, how I occupy this space and how I embody it and also how I deal with obstacles and mistakes, even if they're only slight, as well as they're major as well. So hopefully you've got an idea as to why I'm talking about this book, even if I haven't talked about this book in massive detail specifically. It's looking at this idea overall of what should we do about philosophy in the 2020s. Just to go through the 4 parts of this book, just to make it relevant and so I can actually explain a little bit about this book just as we're coming to the end of the video. It's separated out into 4 parts, which is the method, in terms of what's philosophy about. That's what I was starting to describe there, like in terms of discourse, in terms of discussions. Part 2 is all based on different spiritual exercises, which again is absolutely fascinating, especially to do with Christian philosophy and ancient philosophy. Part 3 looks at very particular people. So you might have heard of Socrates, you might have heard of Marcus Aurelius. It'll start to go into the details about who they are and how they lived more specifically. And then for part 4, it's looking at different themes overall, but very much combining what has already been said to make philosophy a way of life, rather than just an abstract process where you go to university and you get a degree in it because you've learnt it in a very formal, analysed way, an analytical way. It's about understanding, okay, you don't have to go through that process unless you want to, on a more basic level. What's my thought? What's my insight? When I think of this word, what's the definition? And ultimately, what am I going to do about it? I've given plenty of book recommendations on this series. We can keep it as a nice little abstract thought of, oh, imagine if I actually read all 15 of them. Challenge yourself. Take that question seriously. Genuinely, now, just to finish this video, what would happen to you and your life if across this next year you actually read all 15 of these books? What happens then? And I can't answer that for you. Philosophy is a way of life. Reading is a way of life. Transformation is a way of life. You can do it. You'll have to slow down, maybe have to change a few things, but you can do this.